Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today, we'll be doing lots of metal effects and heavy weathering during the build of this resin-printed Obi-Wan Kenobi lightsaber hilt. Alright, for starters, this is a free file that I found on Thingiverse. I will link it, as well as all the other materials I used, down in the description below. This build started out like any other resin print build, lots of sanding and removing of supports. And so while you watch me post-process these parts, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of this lightsaber hilt. This hilt has long been one of my favorite pieces in the Star Wars universe, and from the moment I started my channel, I knew that one of these days I was going to have to try my hand at recreating it. At the time though, I knew that I lacked sufficient knowledge to accurately recreate this prop, so all the other lightsaber hilt builds on this channel have been me slowly chipping away at learning the necessary processes to recreate this hilt. At the risk of sounding extremely hyperbolic, I genuinely believe that this lightsaber hilt is one of the most beautiful props ever created for Star Wars, and everything about its construction and history is quintessential to what makes Star Wars, Star Wars. Now I know that's a bold claim, and maybe it's only true from a certain point of view, but humor me as I delve a little deeper. The pictures you're seeing here are 15 or 16-year-old Brunger's first attempt at recreating this lightsaber hilt. As you can see here, I was working off of very limited knowledge, just measuring off of a piece of paper and attempting to create the episode 3 variant of this hilt. These pictures come courtesy of my dad, and it was actually on the lathe in his shop where I first played wannabe prop builder. As you can see, I never actually finished the project, and I don't really remember if I ever touched a lathe again after this point, but the desire to have a completed hilt has always been in the back of my head. Fast forward over a decade later, and it wasn't until I watched A New Hope with my son for the first time that I really became interested in the history behind the making of Star Wars. I'm nowhere near as knowledgeable as some people, and everything that I do know just comes from reading through the Complete Lightsaber Prop Guide. If you're at all interested in Star Wars history, I highly recommend you check it out, because it's a really fascinating read. Anyway, back to my claim that the Obi-Wan hilt is the greatest prop ever built for Star Wars. Now obviously, Luke's Graflex is iconic, and Star Wars wouldn't be Star Wars without the Graflex. But something about the fact that it is mostly just a flash gun knocks it down a few pegs in my mind. If you look at Obi-Wan's lightsaber, almost every piece comes from a completely different source. Something about all the pieces being in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, and so serendipitously coming together. In my mind, this is everything that made Star Wars, Star Wars. With all the movies and shows coming after Episode 4, I feel like it's kind of taken for granted that Star Wars has just always been Star Wars. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but to me, what makes the original trilogy so special is that strange combination of just slapping junk together quickly, because it had to get done quickly, but then out of that chaos arises true beauty that in the end is really greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, now that the usual prep is out of the way, it's time to talk about prepping your parts to look like metal. In the reference photos I was using, I was seeing that this emitter had a bunch of small circular scratches around the surface and sides of the part. This part originally comes from a jet engine, and so I imagine it receives these scrapes because it spins doing something within the engine. To accomplish this look, I put it on my drill press at a very slow speed and used a file or a razor blade to scrape the grooves into the surface. I then gave it a few scratches along the edges just to help add to that aged metal look. I did the same thing to what is called the booster section on the lower end of the hilt. I then shot all these metal pieces with semi-gloss black. Doing these scuffs and scrapes before paint ensures that once you've laid down your metal color, these grooves and scratches also take on that same metal color. Once I was done painting all the metal pieces black, I gave the grip section some special treatment. If I remember correctly, this part was originally made from steel, and so in all the reference photos I was seeing, there was this slight, rusty, gunky buildup in the lower grooves of the grip. So to mimic this look, I spun the grip while spraying Rust-Oleum truck bed liner at a distance further than what is recommended. This made sure that none of the big globs of truck bed liner hit the grip, but instead all the tiny misty bits settled all over the surface and into the grooves. And here's the grip after 2 gentle coats of truck bed liner. Once that was dry, I sanded all the high points so that I was left with just the truck bed liner in the recesses of the grip. As you can see, I didn't remove it completely from the high points, and this left me with just a nice, interesting texture across the whole surface. I then used a file and some 60 grit sandpaper to give the grip a pass of heavier weathering. And this is what I was left with. I started off painting the grip with what has now become my favorite brown color. This is Vallejo's Game Color Smoky Ink. It's a really nice rusty old metal brown, and my intention was for this to serve as the rusty undercoat for subsequent layers. In the end, this step was probably a bit unnecessary since the black coat that came next kind of covered most of this brown, but my heart was in the right place. One of the big things I am learning through all these projects is that as long as you paint gently with very light layers, you can do multiple coats of different colors and in the end be left with a surface that is never truly one color. This helps the end product look more real since no old weathered piece is ever truly one color. I usually dry brush my Vallejo metal colors, but this time around I wanted to try airbrushing, and I was not entirely thrilled with the process. Even though I was being really gentle, the paint seemed to lay down really thin and runny, and the metal pigment seemed to gather in the lower points. But since I knew I was going to be doing a pretty heavy chalk weathering on all these pieces, I wasn't too worried about it. The paint colors I used on this part of the process were Vallejo's Duraluminum, White Aluminum, Engine Manifold, and Gunmetal Gray. And for the brass, I used Rub 'n Buff's Antique Gold. I went a bit heavier with the brass dry brushing than I normally would, but this was because I knew I'd be weathering it pretty heavily with chalk later down the road, and I wanted a lot of that brass color to shine through. I then moved on to giving the grip a black wash. On a whim, I threw some dark gray into there just to see how it would look, but I was really unhappy with the results, so I quickly added more black and more water. But in the end, my wash was a very thick consistency, and so that's why you see me just squirting water all over the prop. I then spent way more time than was necessary removing excess paint from the grip. But after lots of brushing and wiping, this was the final result. I then used that same black wash on the booster section at the bottom of the hilt. I purposely watered the wash way down for this piece and did multiple coats until I was happy with the color. I did this because I wanted this piece to look like its black coating was wearing away with age. So with every coat, I was also making sure to wipe it away from the very highest points. Even though I had pretty terrible results with this metal powder on my Graflex build a couple weeks ago, I decided to do it on the buttons just to add slight variation to the metal colors that I was using. This prop is going to sit on my shelf and not be handled very much, and so I was okay using this very finicky powder on these pieces. From there, I moved on to my first experience painting with lacquer paints. For these pieces that are chrome plated on the original lightsaber, I wanted to try out using all-clad. I'd seen lots of people get very shiny results with this paint, and so I figured this would be the perfect solution for these pieces. The hobby store that I bought the paint at did not have All-Clad's gloss black base that they recommend for going beneath their chrome paint, so instead I bought All-Clad's black primer and clear gloss, thinking that this would get me to about the same point as the gloss black base. I still don't know if these products are different in any way, but I do know I wasn't able to achieve the same shiny chrome surface that I've seen other people get. This could have also been because I didn't prep the pieces as well as I should have, and when it came time to paint the chrome, I probably should have sprayed it a bit lighter than I did. In the end, I was happy with the results that I got, but I'll have to do some more testing down the road. I will say that after a bit of buffing, the chrome paint was much shinier than it initially was. Once the black wash on the grip was dry, I went over the entire thing with a very light dry brush of Vallejo's Gunmetal Gray. I just wanted the edges to look just a tiny bit shinier than the rest of the piece. I then assembled a few of the pieces and did my first light coat of chalk weathering. Alright, this is where the fun begins. I should start by saying a big thank you to the Smuggler's Room. He's the first person I ever saw use chalk as a weathering technique, and since then I've fallen fully in love with this process. As with any weathering, it's completely up to you how light or heavy you go with this technique, but it lends itself really well to replicating fine dust, but also very gunky rust and corrosion, and I definitely stretched it to its limits on this build. For this prop, because I was worried that some of the paint might be a bit delicate, I used water to water down my matte Mod Podge instead of IPA. I started out using a brown and a gross green color for the weathering on the brass. I then moved on to mixing those same two colors with some black for the grip. Like I said before, on this step, don't be afraid to do layer after layer of different colors, since in the end, this variation of colors is what's going to really sell the realism of your prop. Also keep in mind that different materials are going to weather differently. For instance, I caked a bunch of black down into this emitter since I figured that with lots of exposure to heat, this area would see lots of charring. For the exterior of the emitter, I really wanted to replicate the look that I was seeing in all my reference photos. And so I just did multiple passes, going round and round in circles, and wiping away and adding more and wiping away and adding more until I was happy with the look. For the booster piece towards the bottom of the hilt, most of my reference photos made this part look like it was made from aluminum, and so using that as my jumping off point, I made sure that my weathering didn't include a lot of rusty colors, since aluminum does not rust, like the steel grip would. After some weathering on the base, the chrome paint was dry and ready for assembly and weathering. Just a quick tip to anybody who might build this same file: assemble all these pieces without this tab in the clamp box. It's too tall and sticks out proud, and I had a heck of a time trying to get it back out. Once the entire hilt was assembled, I did a little bit of weathering around the connection points just to make sure the whole thing was tied together, and then moved on to very lightly weathering the chrome. For the chrome, I just used matte Mod Podge so that it was extra thick, and then made sure that the chalk that I applied was also extra thick. I was going for that look that chrome gets once the plating is worn away and the part beneath it begins to rust, and the rust sort of bubbles up on the surface. I started out with some brown and dark orange mixed together, and then finished off with some very light dabbing of brighter orange. I'm actually really happy with the way that this came out. At the very last minute, I realized that the reproduction bubble strip I had ordered was not going to arrive in time for the video, so I cleaned out my resin tank, put in some clear resin, and printed out two versions of the bubble strip, one where the bubbles were hollow and one where they weren't. And after some initial sanding to clean up the supports, both of them lost their translucency. So to get that back, I coated them both with a clear gloss. In the end, I chose the bubble strip that was not hollow, and then this lightsaber was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. About all I can think to say for this project is that I'm incredibly happy with the way everything turned out. And even though I felt a bit silly doing layer after layer on every individual piece, I think the results really speak for themselves. And sitting on my shelf, I don't think anybody would be able to tell that this was not an original prop pulled straight from the movie. Okay, maybe not that good, but pretty close. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a video every Saturday. Thank you again for watching. Have a good day.